All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Happy hump day to you on this Wednesday. My name is Yolanda Trotman. I want to welcome you to this very special episode of The Conversation tonight. So excited because we are launching a new series here on The Conversation where we are specifically dealing with the system. And by the system, of course, I mean the criminal justice system. So the new show or this new series is called The Indictment. And the idea for this show actually began specifically in response and as a result of the Ahmaud Arbery murder and what we were seeing in terms of how the system had not even really began to give him and his family justice. And this was before the wake of the George Floyd murder and, of course, where we are now. So it almost seems serendipitous that the idea of the show came about when it did, because it was more so to really educate us collectively about the system and the things that we can do to change it. And I feel so blessed that our guest tonight and our guests in upcoming episodes, all of this came together literally within a matter of a few hours. And so tonight's segment, which is the first segment, is an overview, if you will, over the criminal justice system. And we're going to be talking about, obviously, the major cases that are going on. We're going to be talking about them from a legal perspective, but I chose to call it the indictment because it's a big picture view of the system. But I'm inviting you to become involved as grand jurors. Your responsibility as grand jurors is to make sure that you give us feedback, that you ask questions, and that you join us in the conversation. And so if you didn't already see the post, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, one of the tasks that I want you all to do is to do the implicit bias test. Now, that test is a Harvard test, and Renee is going to talk a little bit about the details as far as that's concerned, but it's eye-opening, because one of the things and why I chose to use implicit bias as one of the first things that we talk about is because the reality is that we all do it. You have people who routinely will say, oh, I don't see color. That's not true. We all do it regardless of whether we are black, white, or whatever our race is. And implicit bias is very much real. So it's so incredibly important that we not only acknowledge it, because if once we acknowledge it and we're armed with the reality of what it actually is, then we put ourselves in a better position to be able to deal with it. So we're going to jump right to it. So I'm incredibly excited about our two guests tonight, two attorneys who have a long history here in Charlotte in terms of fighting for the people and making sure that they are making an impact both within the courtroom and outside of the courtroom. And of course, as always, if you have not already done so, make sure that you like, follow, and subscribe at all things at the Convo Pod Show. So if you have not subscribed to the YouTube channel, make sure that you do that tonight. If you're not following the Facebook page, please make sure you do that tonight. And if you haven't gone over to the Instagram page, make sure that you follow that as well. So the show tonight, The System Revealed. And so our first guest is a dear friend who I have known since I actually began my career at the public defender's office. I knew who he was, but I didn't really get to know him until he actually made the decision to leave where he was and then to go into private practice, when I really got to know who he was. But when I came on board in the public defender's office back in 2002, he was one of a few African-American prosecutors in the office. And once I got to know what his role was, he was prosecuting homicides. He made the decision to leave the prosecutor's office and go into private practice. And since then, you may have seen him on local news stations talking about specific cases and talking about, how certain rules or certain laws can be applied in certain cases. I definitely see him becoming a legal commentator at some point, or legal correspondent at some point in the very near future. So that being said, welcome to the show, Mr. Rob Corbett, attorney at law. Hello, sir. How are you, dear?
Hello. I'm doing fine, Ms. Trotman. How are you?
I'm good, and welcome to the show. Welcome to the show. So I got a couple questions that I've got to ask you first before we get started. So because inquiring minds, I'm sure want to know. So you began your career. Did you begin your career at the DA's office?
Yeah, right out of law school.
Okay. And law school where?
I'm sorry, North Carolina Central University in Durham, North
Okay.
Carolina.
You gonna shout out your Eagles? You gonna
Let's
do
say you
that?
got to do the full name. Have to do the full name.
Okay. North Carolina Central University.
University School of Law, Durham, North Carolina.
University School of Law. And I can't throw up no eagle sign. I can't do that. I ain't finna start no stuff, but you can if you want to.
Well,
Where'd
no,
you
I
go
don't
to?
want to mess around. Mess around and end up doing it wrong, so I just stopped.
Now, where'd you go to undergrad?
Undergrad was North Carolina State
Okay.
in Raleigh. So
Now, are you from North Carolina originally?
yeah, born and raised here in Charlotte.
Okay. So Charlotte
So
native.
Charlottean.
Yes, something of a unicorn in this day and age, but in a good way for sure. For those of you who are just joining us, of course, this is the first installment of the indictment. Hey, Paula. Hey, Ashley. Hey, Dickerson. I see y'all. But definitely make sure that you're dropping questions that you have in the comments so that we see them so that we can answer them. So you started off at the DA's office. Was it
Yeah,
all?
back
Was it
then.
all? Was it always
Oh,
something that you wanted to do to become a prosecutor, or did you want to do something else while you was in law school?
while I was in law school, I knew that I wanted to litigate. I went to NC State, so I had a technical background. So at the time, I thought I probably wanted to do intellectual property law.
Hmm.
But I was on the trial team while I was in law school. I enjoyed that. And then I was looking at various intellectual property firms, and during the interview process, they were telling me that you're not going to go to court very often. You're not going to go to trial, and ended up at the DA's office, and that's just fortuitous. Honorable Gary Henderson. I went to high school with him. Gary Henderson is a district court judge here in Charlotte. He was a year ahead of me in high school. And once you graduated, you got to decide where you had your swearing in ceremony. So I chose Charlotte to make sure my parents could be there. And Gary introduced me. And at that time, I didn't have a job. And Gary said, "This is Rob Corbett. He wants to litigate. So, come talk to him." So the district attorney at that time was Peter Gilchrist, and he came up to me and said, "If you want to try cases, then send me your resume." And then
Hmm.
that's how I got the job.
And now, what year was that? I'm not trying to age you, I
Uh,
promise.
oh yeah, no, but 2000.
Okay, so started off with a misdemeanor unit.
Yeah, started off the misdemeanor unit December of 2000. Worked misdemeanor cases for a year. Then moved to a felony team. Worked property crimes for about 3 years. Moved to drug team. Worked that for about a year. Moved to At the time, it was called Persons, where we handle violent assault, sexual assault cases. Did that for a couple of years, and then moved to the homicide team in 2008. And I was a homicide prosecutor from 2008 to 2012.
Okay. And so for most people who may not know that, when you start off as a prosecutor, obviously you'll start off in a misdemeanor unit, but to move from the misdemeanor unit to the felony unit within a year is pretty impressive. Or are you just going to be humble?
Well, no, I've got to stay humble. And then, it was, I'll say like different back then. The office wasn't as big as it is now. Maybe it might have been easier to sort of like move if you didn't have like that backlog. But yeah, it was good in terms of at the time I said, hey, that was like a good job, best job that I had. You
Hmm.
got a lot of experience. That's, what you were interested in terms of trying cases, being in court, but then like moving on to the felony team where you got to do different types of cases. That was better.
What was your favorite unit?
I don't know if necessarily moving towards when I was on persons and the homicide team, I probably say between those two. And I think because you had victims in those types of cases, of where if you're at least like you're thinking in some part is that you're bringing justice to like those people versus where you have victimless crimes and state still prosecuting in terms of the drug crimes or property crimes, and there's no laws or properties recovered. So I would say because of that, in terms of feeling like you're actually helping people, then I would say in terms of being on those felony teams, the violent crimes and the homicide.
Mm. And so you said earlier, you said that you had a technical background. Is that why you gravitated more towards being a DA versus going and applying at the public defender's office?
No, it was, just beginning when I was in law school. I probably never thought about being a prosecutor, just because of, how you just look at the system and see that there are like too many of us in terms of in court, or the old Richard Pryor joke. You go to court, you see justice, which is just us. But I think I was actually open to both and had applied to both in terms of the public defender's office here in Charlotte, as well as the DA's office. And I just got the call first to go to work at the DA's office.
And it was so interesting. Like, my story was the complete opposite. Like, I thought I wanted to be a prosecutor and went to law school, thought I was going to be a corporate lawyer. Not really, big firms, not my thing. Came to Charlotte, had a student who, David Kelly. So
Yeah.
David Kelly was one of my students in high school, and was one of my debate assistant coaches. And he's the one who suggested I apply at the public defender's office. I couldn't find a job. I didn't go to a North Carolina law school. It was tough. And so I was offended that the DA's office did not even interview me. Like, couldn't get an interview. But the public defender's office is where I had a connection through Kevin Tully and Jason Reese at the time, who were PDs at the time, who helped coach my mock trial team. So that's how I ended up there. But I always thought if I was ever going to do criminal work, that I would be a prosecutor. And it almost seems crazy now. Like, I couldn't imagine myself being on that side. So the big $100,000 question before I bring our other guests up there so we can jump into the topic. What made you decide to leave the prosecutor's office and go into private practice? Because you were homicide, like you were doing homicide stuff.
No, it's a little, more complicated in terms of, I can say honestly that I thought about in terms of making that switch in terms of doing defense work. I remember seeing Bryan Stevenson's, and I say this all the time, I saw his TED Talk on YouTube, and I was like, that's the type of defense attorney that, I would want to be like. But I never had the confidence or that I thought I could make the switch. So I always say in terms of, sometimes when you can't make a decision, God makes the decision for you. So it came a time of where it be a mutual decision for both parties that I should probably move on. So, but I don't say that in terms of any regret, because, this is what being on this side, which is what I wanted to do. Being on this side is who I think I'm fulfilling who I am or who I'm supposed to be. And I'm helping people in ways that I never did before. And if I could just jump in, I remember I was talking to Honorable Yvonne Mims Evans, who's like retired Superior Court judge. And she asked me, do you think you're helping people more on the defense side versus the prosecutor side? I said, I think I'm helping people more. And she said, yeah, because, you don't help anybody. You can't help people as much as a prosecutor as you can in terms of having the impact on people's lives or helping people get a second chance that you can as a defense attorney.
And so when you left, what year was it that you left?
2012.
And quiet as kept, that was a big deal. They were like, Rob leaving? Like, okay, welcome, sir. Was there a learning curve for you, or did it just feel more natural?
Definitely a learning curve, because you don't want to take, you can't take away from people who have been doing this for, a significant amount of time. I can say that I knew how to try a case. But there's more to it in terms of this side, in terms of going in the courtroom, being able to try a case. You have to be able to, you're interacting more with clients than, you don't have clients when you're the prosecutor, or say you represent the state, but you're interacting more with people, different types of people who may have issues that go beyond in terms of their court case, and learning to navigate that. There's a learning curve in terms of managing your schedule, because every prosecutor thinks that their case in their county is the most important thing. And on this side, you're frequently having to be called in multiple courthouses, or have to be multiple counties, all at the same time. And then, back to the trial, as a prosecutor, I could focus on that one case. And if I wasn't ready on that case, nobody would say anything if that case wasn't number one on the calendar. As a defense attorney, you might have a couple of irons in the fire at the same time. And if you say, I'm not ready, it falls on deaf ears, because they expect that case is called, they expect you to go.
And so for those of you who may be just joining us, this is the first installment of the Indictment which is a series where we're going to be taking a deeper dive in the criminal justice system. Our first guest is Rob Corbett, attorney extraordinaire. He's way too humble. We can toot your own horn for you, but former prosecutor, now a defense attorney with his own practice, the Corbett Law Firm here in Charlotte. If you've not seen him in trial, he is phenomenal. And his associate Josh, I don't know if Josh, if you're watching, they are definitely a dynamic duo for sure, as far as really advocating for their clients. So that's my plug. There we go.
Okay.
All right. So that being said, let's jump in. And I'll bring Renee back on when I see her in the studio. But one of the big things that we want to talk about tonight is what is the state of what is really happening here, because we have major cases that are taking place all across the country. We obviously have a very, very, very different feel in terms of a movement. It's palatable and it's energizing, I think, for many people in a way I don't think we've seen in a long time. But the bigger question is, what does justice look like, especially when we're looking at cases that are so different? Like I said at the beginning, like this whole show was based on specifically dealing with the Ahmaud Arbery case. And then here we are 2 weeks later with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others who have been murdered at the hands of police and as a result of police brutality. And we have to dig deeper. So before I do that, I'm going to bring Renee in because I see her. So our next guest is Renee Little. She is, now listen, now there's some people that you just meet, right? And then there's other people who become like family. And so Renee and I literally met as a result of a case. I was trying a case. I really wish I could remember what year it was. And a juvenile who had been charged and his case was done, they were trying to pull a fast one, if you will, and have him be called as a witness. Wasn't on the witness list. I had no idea what was going on, raising all kinds of holy hell. And so I knew that this was outside of my purview as far as dealing with some juvenile issues. And was I missing anything in terms of how he could testify? Could he testify? So I called over to Council for Children's Rights. In comes a woman I'd never met before, but she came in the room like, oh, what we not finna do is this. And immediately I loved her. Her name is Renee Little. I'm not going to tell her story for her because she's going to tell you, but we became really close, really, really close, as I began my journey to become a district court judge back in 2014. And she is on your ballot in November for district court judge. And what is so awesome about her story is the fact that she doesn't have an opponent, that she ran for an open seat and nobody ran against her because really, you're not going to do that, first of all. But she is on your ballot unopposed. I'm so excited to have her on the show. And she really has been involved in our local initiative, which is called Race Matters for Juvenile Justice. She's been a tremendous advocate for juveniles over the years. She will be one of your next district court judges that will be sworn in. But I wanted her to come on board because part of what we'll specifically be talking about is implicit bias, what your own biases are, and how it impacts the bigger system that we're going to talk about. So welcome to the show. Hey, girl. Hey.
Can I call you Judge Trotman? I can't call you Judge Trotman.
Girl, whatever works for you, boo. I still, once a judge, always a judge, so they say.
Amen.
So.
Amen. How are you, Judge?
I am fabulous. How are you?
I am well. I am so honored to be here. I mean, you know, I'm going to shout you out as I tell my story because you've been instrumental in my change, in me seeking office, seeing you not only run, but the way you represented your clients, the way you supported people in the community before you ran was inspiring. And I think that's important as we talk about the voices of people of color and the intersection of race and even in women, given what's happened to Breonna Taylor and Sandra, say her name, so many other women. So thank you for what you've done in our community, both on and off the bench.
And I love you for that. Thank you, my dear. So, all right, y'all, I'm going to let y'all take it from here. So first question, or one of the first questions that was posed. Let's start with the Ahmaud Arbery case. And for those of you that are just tuning in, if you have specific questions, make sure you drop them in the comments, drop a hand wave so that we see that you're here. Hey, Paula. Hey, Beverly. Hey, Ann. Okay, Miss Johnson Lewis, saw her earlier today. You know it's bad when we just get so excited about seeing somebody in the courthouse that we haven't seen forever. So let's start first with Ahmaud Arbery. And Rob, I'll ask you to take this question. So I think one of the big things, well, there's two things. One, the big issue that created uproar was how do we go so long without any type of real investigation and any charges? Do you think, had it not been for public perception that, and this might be a dumb question, honestly, but if it been any public backlash or perception, do you think those gentlemen would have ever, and I say gentlemen loosely, would have ever been charged?
No, I don't. I think without the public outcry, without the various local media and national media getting involved, neither of the McMichaels, Travis or Greg, or William Bryant would have been charged. And I think that goes towards the discretion or how much discretion that your local elected prosecutors have. You have that the first prosecutor on the case recused herself because Greg McMichael at one time used to work in her office, but that wouldn't have precluded her from informing law enforcement that charges should be brought. Prosecutors usually act as an advisor. They can't tell you go out and charge someone, but they can say, if you do charge, we will prosecute. But that wouldn't have, even with that, her having to recuse herself, that wouldn't stop charges being brought. Then you have the second prosecutor, who it's not unusual for prosecutors to draft an opinion as to why they are neglecting to prosecute a case, but he seemed to go above and beyond and was mounting or making defense points as to why he wasn't going to bring charges. So like I first saw or heard of the case, there was a New York Times article about it, but I think in terms of the activists who were pushing it, like I said, the national media, and then ultimately the video being leaked, I think there's a strong argument that charges would not have been brought. It wouldn't have gotten to the point that it is now.
What do you think, Renee?
First of all, let me just say this, and hello to my brother Rob, who's also an inspiration to me in these here legal streets. I as a lawyer, as a judicial candidate, and frankly, as a first-generation American, I've always believed in our system of justice. I believe that the law should be an equalizer. Most people are proud of to be American citizens and aspire to do justice. It is incredibly concerning that we live in a world where a person of color is often not giving the benefit of doubt or the presumption of innocence, right? And in this situation, that did not happen the other way. You have a situation where, and I know the facts are still coming out, but citizens took something into their own hands and there was no investigation. I mean, beyond the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's what's so concerning in this case. It's always a little concerning when your worst nightmare as a legal supporter, they come true, right? You hear people thinking that the law isn't fair. You hear people thinking and knowing in some ways that there's two systems of justice in this country. And when you see something like that playing out, it's disturbing. And what makes it more disturbing, and I'll shoot this back to my brother Rob, is that we try to trust prosecutors. You hear about prosecutorial discretion. You hear about that standard of excellence that you want for prosecutors. And the fact that people have had to recuse themselves because it's concerning. It's incredibly concerning in this case. I'd love your thoughts on it, Yolanda. But I first heard about the shooting in February and thought, okay, here we go. But until we saw the video and knew that there was more, I did not know that there's a possibility that those who take an oath to uphold the law may possibly be complicit in not assisting with justice.
So before you, because I want you to respond to that, Rob, but we do have a couple more questions that I want to pop up. So Paula asks, how are they treating the witness or the videographer? I presume, Paula, you're talking about the gentleman who was first saying, hey, I just was here and I recorded it. to no, sir, you were involved. Rob, you want to take that?
Yeah, so I believe she's referring to William Bryan. So William Bryan was the person in the vehicle behind them and who was recording everything. So originally he was not charged, but a little while later he was charged with felony murder as well as attempting to commit false imprisonment. And he has now, if I go into that, he has now provided evidence against the McMichaels. So that's what happens when you charge multiple people, then, at least one person is going to give a statement to try to help themselves out.
Or become a snitch. Right. That part.
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to say it in a nice way. Yeah.
Yeah, he became a snitch. But okay, because that's what happens. That's obviously what happens. Rob, explain to people who are just tuning in what felony murder is, because that's usually not a concept that we know murder, we know all this, but people may not understand what felony murder actually means.
Yeah, Georgia and North Carolina, as well as like some other states, have the felony murder rule. And felony murder is that if you commit a felony and you have a dangerous weapon and somebody dies during the course of that felony, then everybody that's involved in the original felony can be charged with murder. So an example that I usually give, if I'm the getaway driver and I tell my buddy, hey, you go in the convenience store, don't do anything stupid, just get the money and come out. He goes into the store, tries to rob the clerk, and he accidentally shoots the clerk. That wasn't his intent. That was never discussed. And it happened in an accident because of the struggle. He's charged with first-degree murder, and I'm charged with first-degree murder because the felony was to commit a robbery. And if somebody dies during the course of that felony, then everybody gets charged with first-degree murder. So what you have here is that I'm assuming that they're saying the felony was the assault on Mr. Arbery, since the McMichaels are charged with felony assault as well. And they've also charged the three of them, the McMichaels and the videographer, with felony murder because they're saying Mr. Arbery was killed during the course of that felony.
And so one of the questions may be, or one of the questions that I saw earlier was, well, but why not first degree murder instead of the assault and then the felony murder as a result?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an argument to charge first degree murder. And because first degree murder requires premeditation. And sometimes people say, well, if it's first degree murder, that means that you have to plan it out. And you say, well, hey, they didn't plan for a week that they were going to go off and kill someone. But the law states that premeditation can occur over some period of time, no matter how short. So, what you always hear is that the amount of time that it took to raise a gun, put your finger on the trigger, apply pressure, that's enough time to form premeditation. So they certainly could have been charged with it. But I think probably why they went with felony murder is that is an easier charge for a prosecutor to prove, because all the prosecutor has to prove is that a felony occurred. And if you, the jury, believe that, then you vote guilty, versus you don't have to worry about premeditation and then worry about if you have to any lesser charges that could go to the jury. Felony murder is like
this is in Georgia though, right? This was in Brunswick, Georgia, correct? Yeah. And they don't have the same degrees as we do. So my understanding, and I did practice as a public defender for a short time in Georgia, is that, they don't classify their first and second degree in the same way we do. I think the thing that's important also, and Rob knows this from his years on the other side, is that it's incredibly important to charge what you think you're going to get, because the people that we don't often talk about, Judge and Mr. Corbett, it's the jury. It's the jurors. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about implicit bias, but we can charge people all day, but you're looking at to see what facts are going to stick based on the law. And more importantly, can you get a conviction? And so we'll talk a little bit more about jurors and implicit bias, but that's the group that I'm not most concerned about, but I think that we often leave out when we have these conversations about the system. We can do a lot to train officers. We can do a lot to train our judges. We can do a lot to train attorneys on both sides of the aisle, prosecutors and defense. But regular people are coming into these cases as jurors with their own implicit biases, and They will sometimes, unfortunately, talk themselves out of certain things if and you know it, Rob, and you know it, Yolanda, if things don't align with their worldview, no matter what the attorneys have done. And so I think hopefully in these cases with Arbery, as well as the other cases, the prosecutors are charging based on what they know they can prove in hopes that there is a conviction. The thing that I just kind of want to get your thoughts on that I'm a little concerned about, and this kind of harkens back to the 50s and 60s. There was a time in this country where states didn't do right by people of color, where you couldn't really expect sometimes justice in the state. And so the federal government had to get involved. Here in this Arbery case, you're talking about local authorities sitting on something. GBI comes in, and how long did it take, Rob, once GBI got the case? I mean, within a week or so, Mr. Bryan
less than a week. I think they came in on March 2nd, I think on a Tuesday, and then the video gets released the 4th.
So I think
and then charges late right after that.
Yeah, so I think what's concerning as we look at this holistically is that you're now talking about a situation where the authorities that were charged to do justice locally sat on something for almost 80 days, right? We didn't see this video, but GBI is able to come in and within 2 weeks have a theory of the case regarding Mr. Bryan's more than likely involvement, given the fact that he did the video. And to me, that's a little concerning when we talk about systems of justice too. We need to be able to rely on our local authorities, and you're not going to always be able to bring the GBI in. You're not going to always be able to have, Eric Holder isn't coming through that door all the time. And so I think there's something to be said about making sure that the people that are serving us locally, that they're held accountable, that they do the right thing, because this isn't every day, but it is concerning that you had to bring GBI into
and
this.
make sure the people, and GBI means what for those people?
I'm sorry, Georgia Bureau Investigation, that they are now handling the case. And I think to Rob's point, there were how many prosecutors have recused themselves? Maybe 2 or 3?
And first 2, and then the third one called them in.
Yeah, and so.
And we'll get to that really more so when we get into the bias part. But I have to say this before I post up the next question. This is why local elections are so important. Why our judges matter, because our judges, I just had this conversation last night. It's like if you can't name 5 judges, and if you live in Mecklenburg County and you can't name 5 judges, that's not good. Because even though you may never step foot in the courtroom or the courthouse, it's judges that affect the lives of everyday people, especially in district court, because it can make the difference between a person, not even jail or home. I mean, it's the difference between a person keeping their license and their livelihood, or being able to go home over some minor misdemeanor charge. And especially when we're talking about prosecutorial discretion, our DA is elected, and it's very important that service to the community is still always kept under a microscope. But we'll get to that in a second. Yvette Ingram, I hope she's still with, she's still here. Yvette said, so, and we're still talking about Ahmaud's case. So have the charges against him been upgraded to hate crimes? If so, what effect will it have if they are found guilty? Short answer.
No. There's no hate crime in Georgia. Last I checked, and as I said, I'm licensed there. I've been practicing in North Carolina most of my career, but there is no, that was defeated. So there is no hate crime charge, so to speak, in Georgia.
And so I think to that other question is, do you think the Justice Department will pick it up and do anything of substance? Ooh,
me or Rob.
Either one of you.
You know what? Before Floyd, the Trottman, I wasn't sure. Now, after what's happened in the Floyd matter, what's happened in the Taylor matter, and there's still, with Taylor, there's been a lot of movement in that case. The police officer, I think, retired early, and I don't know if you saw it, but the police report came out today, and it's blank, and it's concerning to a lot of citizens in that community. It's concerning. Yeah, I mean, that police report, it doesn't seem to be accurate given what people know about what happened to her. But given the fact that there's been such a not just national outcry, but an international outcry about people of color just wanting equity, fairness, due process. And due process is part of, to me, that is justice. Our Chief Justice of North Carolina, Cherie Beasley, said very recently, and I agree with her, that justice is a practice. It's not just your end goal. And so I do think there's a heightened sense of, we got to do justice in the Arbery case. We know that people recused themselves. It took almost 80 days for charges to happen. There is no hate crime in Georgia, but his mother is now fighting for that and advocating for that. And I think people are going to work alongside her. And so I just do think that I think the Department of Justice may look at it, and especially given that there's some concerns about what role the prosecutors may have played in this. So I don't have an opinion, but I certainly think in light of everything, there's going to be more movement.
Now, Renee, you practiced in Georgia at the Public Defender's Office for how long?
I practiced in Georgia at the PD's office for just under 4 years, or just at 4 years, mostly in juvenile, of course.
Okay. And did you do any misdemeanor criminal stuff?
I did some misdemeanor criminal stuff. As you know, my passion was for juvenile. So even though I did state court, what they call state court, doing a lot of the misdemeanor court and superior court work, I knew very early on that I wanted to focus on supporting the youth, because my adult clients, when I served them, just looking at them holistically and doing my due diligence, they had so many juvenile charges and had entered the system either through delinquency or dependency. And so I knew then that I love criminal, but I really want to focus on the juvenile aspect and hopefully helping young people not get to the point where they have an adult record.
And so for people who don't know your story, because I didn't ask these two questions on the front end, and for those of you just joining us, Renee is also on your ballot in November for district court judge. Now, you mentioned two things that I think people may not know. You mentioned that you're a first generation American citizen,
Yes.
and first attorney in the family.
I am.
Okay.
I just talked about that. Yeah.
So let's
Hopefully
get to
not
it.
last.
Now, where are you from? Where's your family from originally?
Sure. So I was born in New York to parents from West Africa. My mother is from Monrovia, Liberia. My dad was from Freetown, Sierra Leone, but raised in Liberia. So my parents came to this country, given, first of all, Liberia's ties with America. Proud to be a country that has ties to America, given the freed slaves that started it. And so my parents came here as students and loved it. We've always loved America. Liberians love America. And I was born here. My sister was born in Charlotte a year and a half after me. And so Charlotte has really been home most of my life. Because we lived in Atlanta for a brief stint when I was growing up. I was licensed both in North Carolina and Georgia. I wanted to be able to support both sides of my family. And when they came from Liberia, my father's side settled in Georgia, Atlanta primarily, and my mother's side settled here in Charlotte. As I said, I went to Clark Atlanta University, HBCUs matter. Shout out to all my Panthers. And really, probably my junior year, knew that I needed to advocate for people in some way. Atlanta was such an amazing place, a historic place where you were often seeing living legends. Andrew Young, Isaiah Williams. Just such an amazing place, especially going to school in the Atlanta University Center. So I knew I wanted to advocate. So I went to law school at the University of Florida, loved it. Thought initially I wanted to be a little bit about the money, but I couldn't help it. I started corporate law at Kilpatrick Stockton and was still drawn to really pro bono things. So started doing work here with the NAACP, headed up by Yvonne Pettis at the time. Volunteered as the guardian ad litem under Vanessa Colston. That's going way back. That's way back, about 2000. And left Kilpatrick Stockton because I really, if I could be frank, I fell in love with public service and really wanted to do that. So went to Georgia, was a public defender in Atlanta, went off on my own and came back home in 2008, where I worked at the Council for Children's Rights until 2015. Went to the clerk's office to be a judicial hearing officer in hopes of getting some skills to round out my experience, as I knew I wanted to be a district court judge and to really devote a lot of my time to juvenile work, and had the honor of connecting with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, which you mentioned, and I can tell you a little bit about that whenever you want. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell. I love justice. I love people. And I really, truly believe that people don't care what you know until they know you care. And our justice system in America has to do a better job of letting people of color know that we care about your dignity, your humanity. whether you did a crime or not, we're supposed to deal with that, but you should never come to court or die before you come to court. You should never feel that your dignity has been compromised, that your humanity has been questioned. And that's really what this current movement's about. That's what your show is about, Yolanda. The conversation is, how do we remind people that at the end of the day, we're human beings that are imbued with dignity and honor, and we really want to uphold that. So that's kind of my philosophy. I want folk to, whether you win or lose, your dignity should stay intact.
Amen to that. So for those of you joining us, we are getting into the heart of the topic, which is we're breaking down what the system is. So Rob, I'm going to ask you first. If somebody asks you, okay, so you're a lawyer, so what, and say that a Martian comes down from Mars. Hey man, what's this system that y'all keep talking about? What would you say? What is the system?
That in terms of how I would describe our criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Criminal justice system is a group of laws that have been set out over time, that have increased, that seek to govern or enforce how we interact or act in society. Particular criminal justice system or those laws or rules that shape how we govern in terms of their violations against the state or government or against each other. And then ideally, in terms of what Renee Hill stated, I'm just going to say Renee Hill as my professor. Renee Little, apologize.
Hey, I love Renee Henderson Hill.
Yeah. So that's my torch professor. Stated in terms of ideally is that it is an equalizer when you walk into that courtroom, and that everybody has the same laws applied to them and should be treated the same way. Now, whether that actually happens, we say no, but that's what we go in advocating for in each and every case.
What would say now, Renee, you don't have a Martian. You have someone that just rose up from, I don't know, we'll just pick a country, who doesn't speak English, but only thing that they know about the system is what they see on television. So we got Martian. So Rob's handled the Martian. Now let's talk about someone who's never been a part of the system, doesn't really know about American custom, but all they know is what they see on television. How would you describe the system to that person?
Well, in fairness and equity, I would really ask if I could find a translator, because I want to learn the language.
Focus.
Right.
Assuming we have a translator. I don't mean, because I didn't have a translator for Rob. Okay. He just naturally spoke Martian.
Good.
Okay, go ahead.
Martian. Okay. Because we do care about ADA. We do want to accommodate people and make sure we honor them, their culture. I would say that our system of justice is one where it is better that 99 guilty people go free than one innocent person be found guilty. I may change that. It is better that 99 people go free than one guilty person be killed before due process. I say due process because we still have the death penalty. No comment in these United States. So I would also say liberty and justice in their language, because that's something that people try to understand, is liberty and justice. But that's it. That's the mantra. I mean, I due process is something that, as Americans, we really pride ourselves on. And as the daughter of immigrants, I'll be frank, we like to pop our collar. If I can get a little colloquial for a second, Judge Yolanda, we really pride ourselves as Americans by comparing ourselves to other governments that do not have due process. So I am the daughter of a woman whose mother, I'm the daughter of Bustlin Brown Cromah, who's the daughter of Maya Viola Brown, who came to this country as under political asylum right after the coup in Liberia. And my grandmother, thank God, was saved and got political asylum here and wasn't killed, but a lot of her colleagues were in Liberia during one of the coups. And so when I think about the fact that we should have a system of justice that is fair, because there are people in this world that don't. It's inexcusable that we're having some of these conversations. I'm glad we are, but it's inexcusable because I am the daughter of immigrants who understand that there are people who don't have due process, that people sometimes will just knock on your door and your father's gone because of his political views. And so I hope that person, that Martian, hopefully that statement It's better that one innocent person go free. Hopefully that will translate in their language and their culture.
And so let's then now we need to just talk plain. Okay. So that's what the system is supposed to be. That's how it's supposed to work. We have DA, we have prosecutors, we have defense attorneys, we have judges, we have jurors, we have support staff, we have all those people who are part of the system, if you will, volunteers, victims, witnesses, police officers. We get all that. But when we look at, for example, Breonna Taylor's case, which is the next one, before we get into George Floyd, how many different ways, and either one of you all can take this, did the system fail here?
Whew.
Well, let's say start from the beginning in terms of exercising the no knock warrant when there was no need to do so. And that I think what I've read, the person of interest was already in custody and didn't live there. They had information that someone had received a package at Miss Taylor's home. So that's why they wanted the warrant, but there's no reason in terms of how they approached it or went there. And then you say if it was any other case or someone else, would they have still acted the same way? There's no need in terms of the whole process, the no knock warrant, the battering ram, what have you, to break into her home. And then you say in terms of additional how system failed, in that still being investigated, no charges brought, where you have with all of these cases, we all know that if it was you or I who were being accused of doing this, system doesn't take that long to make a decision to bring charges. The system brings charges immediately and then starts or continues investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
That's a mouthful.
That's a mouthful.
Well, I think for people who may not really know the background about her case as much as George Floyd or even Ahmaud Arbery's case, I think the thing that is so disturbing is there still doesn't seem to be any, we can't afford to let her name get lost in the shuffle. And what I fear is that if we aren't saying her name as loudly as we are saying George Floyd's name, as loud as we're pushing for justice for Ahmaud Arbery, that she gets lost in the system. I mean, can you imagine you are laying in your bed and not only do they just bust in your house, but you don't even take the opportunity to identify who the person is, and you just open fire. And the fact of the matter is, and just like you said, Rob, there wasn't even a need for that. That wasn't even the person that you were looking for. And even if there was a package there, you still don't have to do a no knock warrant. There's absolutely no reason for that. And it harkens back to, I think, what you were saying, Rob, and what you were saying as well, Renee, as far as, there's opportunities there for people to be seen as humans, to be seen and have their dignity protected. And all of that was a tremendous failure. And you're still not seeing her in the news. You're still not seeing her story being followed the way that it should be. And I feel like as a Black woman, part of that's media driven, because that's not the name that you're hearing chanted. That's not the visual that you're seeing on television. That's not what you're seeing in media. But it's no different how we didn't hold up Sandra Bland's name the way that we should have. We were angry, but we didn't have the same level of anger that we have now. So Renee, I'll have you give me your opinion on this. Do you think that this is based on the fact because she's a Black woman and how we are devalued even more so? Or do you think it's deeper than that based on just the unique circumstances of her case?
I believe in and both. Judge, I do think there is an intersection of race and gender where women are often lost, even in the movement. I'll leave it at that. Even in the movement, if you've been following any of the protests, there have been, even within the movement, women complaining often about marching alongside but still not being heard. So I think it is the intersection of race and gender as her being a Black woman. I also think there is this narrative when it comes to the war on drugs that we still have not healed from, that has harmed our country in some ways. And once again, I'm not giving a political opinion. I'm just saying, once someone hears that there's someone looking for a potential drug dealer, because there's a story that perhaps the police are circulating that, the man they were looking for was a boyfriend of hers, and they saw her car at his house a couple of times, and they saw him in the area. Although, to Mr. Corbett's point, the two suspects they were looking for were already in custody when they executed this no knock warrant. So I think the intersection of race and gender, the fact that we often don't esteem women and we don't esteem Black folk, and Black women find themselves at the end of that, mixed with the narrative that is still in the community, the implicit bias when people hear that somebody knows someone who's a drug dealer. Mm-hmm. The implicit bias when people hear that she wasn't married, this was her boyfriend. The implicit bias of the fact that, I don't know, there were children in the house. All these other things come to play where there's a sense of, is she not as worthy? Is her story not as important? Because, her boyfriend, there's a thought that somebody knew something about drugs. I think it's a dangerous thing that what we're seeing often in the media when it comes to African-American victims, we want to display their whole life, find out what did their mama do, their daddy do, take out the arrest warrant for the person who babysat them. But if you remember Columbine, do you know what those two boys, what their parents look like? Does anybody know what their parents look like? We don't. When it comes to our white brothers and sisters who commit crimes or even alleged, you don't hear anything negative about the background, about their parents. They're almost shielded. But with Brianna, that has not been the case. There's been a sense of, okay, her boyfriend was there. We don't even care about the fact that he, being someone in his home, was protecting his home. You don't hear that narrative. Mm-hmm. I wish that was put in this space. If this is a man, he was pulling LL Cool J, somebody breaking into your home, you next to your queen, you trying to protect your home. That's not the narrative that's been put out there. So I think her story is harder to tell because there's so many implicit things that we feel about people of color that we don't even notice. And sometimes, unfortunately, even people of color hold some of those tropes and ideas about who's worthy to be esteemed and lifted up.
And this thing is like Ashley just commented that we have a tendency to vilify the victim when the victim looks like us. And just like if anybody else that's not Black commits crimes, is, well, there must be something. There must be some reason as to why this crime was committed versus taking it at its face. Now, I want to make sure that we have some time to talk about George Floyd's case, but I really want to circle back with you, Renee, specifically about the implicit bias. So if you are just joining us, I don't want y'all to do it now because it's going to take a few minutes, but I definitely want you to go to this particular website, which is implicit.harvard.edu. It's a series of implicit bias tests. We're going to talk about what implicit bias means, period. But it's not what you think. And don't try to cheat the test because I tried. And it was like, man, I know what they're trying to do. And then the results came. I was like, what? Yeah, don't do what I did. Don't do what I did. But it's interesting. They are going to ask you some like survey questions in the beginning. Just answer those little questions and then you'll get to the actual test itself. It is not anything like you expect. There's one on race. That's the one I want you to start with. But there's one on gender, and there's a couple of others, Renee, that we'll get to, but I want you to start with the one on race because you have no idea why it's asking you the way that it's asking you, but it really is testing like how you relate images, how the words relate to what you see and what your biases are implicitly that you may not even realize, but we'll come back to that. So while you're doing that, y'all write this down and we'll come back to that because I definitely want to make sure that you take that test at some point because it's eye-opening. So let's get to George Floyd. So obviously he has been laid to rest. I say that loosely. I think I can't speak for anyone else. And I said this a couple weeks ago. I literally still have not watched the whole video. I just can't. I will. But I have not yet because I just know who I am. Like I joke about this with friends and social media, like certain things, I just know how I am. And I know like I've never seen 12 Years a Slave. I know I can't because I heard enough about the movie to know I'm gonna be mad at why my white brothers and sisters, this is real talk. Like I'm going to be angry, like angry, rage angry because I know how I react. I know still haven't seen When They See Us. Okay. I know I can't watch it right now because I know it's going to affect how I view people, and I don't want to be unfair. I even remember when I saw the remake of Roots, which wasn't. I think it's more powerful than the original version, but there's two scenes like I like screaming, crying, like just like literally screaming, crying because it was so horrific. Like the imagery was so horrific, and it just got to me almost. It felt like at a cellular level. I say all that to say is that I wonder if, for many of us who are having trouble sleeping, many of us that are struggling, um, many of us as Black women or Black men are, when you walk outside or when you're interacting with people, do you do it differently? All of that, because we have to be realistic in terms of how this constant imagery, affects us. Does it create trauma? I saw where Shantia was watching. Shantia, if you're watching, I really want you to chime in terms of, some things that we may even be able to do to in terms of coping mechanisms. So, but where we are now, as far as George Floyd's case, is that original charges were third degree for Derek. I don't even like to say his last name, for the murderer. Just say that, because I'm not gonna say his name. But they originally were third degree murder and second degree manslaughter, which was interesting. Rob, I'm gonna let you take that. Then it of course got upgraded to second degree. And then, of course, the other officers were charged last week with aiding and abetting. So the big question that I think a lot of people have is, okay, why not first degree? Because if we're talking about premeditation, which is required, just like you said earlier, Rob, it's not the laying in wait behind the bushes, I'm going to shoot you. That's not what premeditation is. That's how some people see it or view it. But does premeditation not begin when you know that, one, he's in cuffs, two, he's restrained, he's not resisting? When you decide to put your knee on this man's neck and leave it there, how does that not get to the point of premeditation when he's constantly begging for his life and for air? How does that not get to premeditation? Or are we still playing it safe of what we think we can prove? Because that's a question of fact that a jury has to decide. And 8 minutes and 43 seconds, like, how does that not evolve into the premeditation or the intent at that point? Because he never moves. He never lets up. He keeps it there the whole time, watching his life be taken from him. Okay, I'm sorry. Go. All right.
No, I think it is an example of them playing it safe. And I sort of had a different viewpoint in terms of what your role is as a prosecutor. And that, and maybe in terms of, this is how I kind of felt that we were at least taught or told in terms of, or at least how I felt we were taught or told when I was there. And that is, you're not looking necessarily in terms of saying that I'm 100% going to get a conviction, but you go for the highest charge based on the evidence. And I say that in terms of how I felt it was when I was there, and how I feel it's applied to, our clients, in terms of that they don't want to hear in terms of, hey, well, this is what my client was thinking, or this is what may have been playing part. Prosecutors' attitude is generally, you tell that to the jury. You go for the highest charge that's supported by law. And there is certainly an argument that first degree in this case would be appropriate, in that, as you talked about, that Derek Chauvin, or I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, you don't say that, well, when he drove up there, he had the intent to kill Mr. Floyd. When he first put Mr. Floyd down, you don't have to say he had the intent to kill Mr. Floyd. But at some point during those minutes towards the end, you can say he formed that premeditation and that intent to kill. But when we say in terms of playing it safe, I remember an interview that Attorney General Keith Ellison had given before he was brought in on the case, when it was still the district attorney was handling it. And he had he talked about the Walter Scott case in South Carolina, the Freddie Gray case in Baltimore. And he said that we don't want to make the mistakes that were done in other places. So and this was before that he was even charged with third degree murder. He said that we want to be able to pick a charge that we know that we'll be able to get a conviction on. So even when he was brought on board, in terms of the Attorney General's office was brought on board, which should have happened at the very beginning, because you're dealing with a police officer, I think that was still factored in as to why he raised it to second degree unintentional murder, but not raising up to first, because what Renee was talking about, that they're taking into account what their jury would think. And I don't think they need to worry about that. I don't think prosecutors need to worry about
I
what the
agree.
jury is going to think about it. But I think that's what they did.
Yolanda, if I could just say, can you hear me?
Mhm.
May I?
Go
Rob,
ahead.
I agree. I agree that you should go for the gusto based and to be frank with you, to honor families. I mean, people have lost folk, and regardless of what's going to happen, I think you should charge in general what you think. You know, look at the evidence and any and everything that applies. You know, I'm not a prosecutor. I've never been on that side, but the concern I have, and I think this is where implicit bias comes in, having been a defense attorney for young people, and I brought it up in RMJJ circles and in safe and not so safe places. I would have clients that had the same act, allegedly, and they would be charged differently for the same act. And you don't have, you already know where I'm going. I mean, I would have kids of color, usually when it came to sexual offenses, all the highest charges, right? The highest charges. And I would have my white young clients, they would always have the charge that was below that could be easily negotiated for some of the same acts. So if we don't think the implicit bias plays a part even in how prosecutors even think about how they're charging, then we're mistaken. And I don't, once again, I don't think it's ever this intentional racial animus, but I think people see people differently. So the fact that when it comes to possibly officers, white, black, or blue, that there is possibly a thought process of knowing implicitly that people feel a certain way about officers depending on their race. So is there a possibility that prosecutors in some of these cases across the country, that the implicit bias of what can we possibly get a conviction for, they're going for that, but when it's someone who's of color that is allegedly committed offense, there are no issues there. We're charging the highest thing. We are going for the gusto. So I think you're right, but once again, it's and both. That's probably what should happen, but what often does happen when it comes to white or non-African American defendants is I think there's a lot that goes into play about, you know, that ends up leading to not necessarily the highest charges that the evidence might bring.
And so, Rob, as a former prosecutor, and specifically as a former homicide prosecutor, does that trouble you that they didn't go for first? I know you said there's an argument for it, but does that trouble you in your experiences? I think you were there, 4 or 5 years in that unit before you left? Like, does that trouble you? Because I'm gonna have to jump in, because I've had clients charged with first degree and not even close, like not even close. But it's charged for shock value. It's charged to keep them in jail. It's charged to hopefully force a plea. I'll never forget one case with a young man who was charged with first degree. He literally, there was a whole bunch of kids that were charged. He was charged. He was the only one that didn't take the plea offer, which was assault. He wasn't even in the area. Like, he was way on a whole other side of the street on the phone when it happened. They still charged him. They would not dismiss it. They wouldn't do anything. And I will say this very specifically, they, meaning the DA's office, tried to try this case on at least 2 separate occasions while I was running for judge. Tried to put it at the top of the order. Even I had just gotten the case from another attorney. And knowing I'm going to be in a 3-week trial and I'm in the midst of a campaign. Is that coincidence? Who knows? Who cares? Doesn't matter at this point. But what I found so disturbing, as hard as I fought for this young man, I got on the bench. 3 months later, it was dismissed. So you mean to tell me all this time that his whole life has been on hold? At 19 years old, you trying to get your first degree. I think the offer was down to some sort of an assault. Like, we're not taking that. Let's go. Let's put 12 in the box. But 3 months later, somebody else gets the case, and now y'all just ready to dismiss it. Okay, but I'm gonna just leave it at that. Very good attorney. Not taking anything away from him, but I'll never forget when he came to my courtroom. I was in courtroom 11:30 to tell me, And one, I want, like, first of all, don't tell me this because now I want to cry because I'm so happy for him. But then it's just like, well, wait a minute. Like, for a year and a half, the facts haven't changed. Like, you got it. The file hasn't changed. The facts haven't changed. Nothing has changed. But now you want to take a dismissal. Okay. But anyway, but the whole point of that, I think it goes to the fact that discretion, while it is important, there's also a responsibility that comes with discretion. So I want to get back to the original question, Rob, that I was asking you, like, does that trouble you, having the amount of experience that you had dealing specifically with homicide cases? And we know people get overcharged all the time to either try to force a plea or to negotiate something, or to at least make sure they get held with no bond or a high bond that they can never make, and hopefully wear them down so they eventually are willing to take a plea, even if their involvement was minimal.
Yeah, I can't say that I was as troubled with the second-degree murder charge as much as I was with the original charge when it was third-degree murder and then second-degree manslaughter. I was more offended by that, and that was coupled with the statements made by the prosecutor before the charges came out, of where during his press conference he stated that, maybe paraphrasing, that, we don't even know if we're going to charge because there's evidence to suggest no crime was committed.
I remember that.
Yeah, I think that's not what your role is,
right,
as the prosecutor. You look at it in terms of, probable cause, a low threshold. Is there some evidence to support that this was the person who committed the crime? And I think only because of public pressure, I think once again, was he only did that. And I think, but for everything that happened and people protesting and then the Attorney General coming in, I think that case would have been negotiated to probably the lowest offense that they could, and then that would be it. For the second-degree murder, and I think that might go to what you were talking about, maybe like cultures within that office. What I mean by that, here we know generally if it's a homicide case, everybody gets first-degree murder. I only can remember, I'm only aware of maybe a few cases of where Mecklenburg County did not charge first-degree murder. One of them involved an officer. But vast majority, they charge everybody across the board first degree, and then they negotiate. So I'd have to say, I would have to know in terms of in that county and, in Minnesota, do they do that? But I see the argument in terms of for second degree, and I can track, I think, how they were thinking. So I say I'm not as offended by that charge. It definitely, I think, needed to be raised. And I think second degree kind of like can fit. But if it was me and I'm making the decision, then I go for first. And then let chips fall where they may, and then have a jury tell me that that's not what it is.
So we got a couple questions I want to jump into before we switch gears for a second. So Paula asked, and this is a good question, how does the relationship with Derek and his relationship with Mr. Floyd, that the media is popping up like, oh, they work together and all of that. Do you think that relationship comes into play in any reason? Or are they trying to throw something out there for a particular motive in this case? Because of course they kept putting the employer out there that they used to work together doing security.
Yeah. And, Renee, tell me if, you disagree. I think that can you be used possibly as motive? You don't have to have motive to prove your case. So, you can, generally, I think, at least like for our jury instructions, motive can be considered, but the absence of motive, it can be equally considered. But if it can be proven that they not only knew each other, but there's some, and I think I may have read, she said like some type of dispute or run-in that they had earlier, I think that's something that can definitely be used for the prosecution, and maybe in the argument in terms of, why it gets raised, depending on like what their dispute was or how long ago.
So, Paula, did you want to weigh in, Renee, before I go to the other question?
I agree with Rob. I don't think you need it, but I think a darn good prosecutor is going to use that in their argument and hopefully hit it home as far as why was it so easy to not, once you have restrained, and why was it so easy to just not make sure he was safe? So, but I agree with Rob.
And so Paula also asked, if they overcharge and don't get convicted, then what? Can they go back to a lesser charge? Short answer is no. So they
No.
overcharge, and then there's a charge conference where there's going to be an argument potentially for lesser included if the defense counsel decides they want to go with lesser included offenses, or if they're going to go for the top count. But the short answer is, if he doesn't get convicted, then jeopardy attaches, and they won't be able to go back and charge him with something else unless there was some sort of whole new case, which in this case that wouldn't be the case. Now, Ann Rose Johnson Lewis, she's also an attorney here in Charlotte. She asked the question, or actually made the comment, what about change of venue? Do you think the defense attorneys are going to file for change of venue, and do you think that strengthens their goal for an acquittal? What do you think about that? What do y'all think about that?
Let me weigh in on here. It's not going to matter. I rarely say that. I think there's reasons for change of venue. They're talking about that in the Arbery case, and that more than likely is going to happen, and obviously sequestering the jurors. The thing about the Floyd case, if we're still talking about Floyd, to my sister-in-law, Ann Rose Johnson Lewis, my cousins from London, folk from Liberia, Denmark, the Floyd case has gone global. I don't know if it's going to matter. And Rob, I'd love to hear your thoughts and yours as well, Yolanda. I don't know in my lifetime if I've ever seen a case where you have people protesting, not just in all 50 states. People have cried out internationally. And so you change the venue, and so what? As far as strengthening their acquittal, I mean, I don't know how you get people to unring this bell unless they've lived somewhere in Iraq or a place culturally where there's not internet or newspaper articles or phones or TikTok.
Did you say TikTok? I'm sorry.
Because I'm sure there's a TikTok on it, right? There's a TikTok about it. There's a TikTok about it.
I quit you. About it. Sustain. No, ma'am. Sustain.
But really, think about it. When we think about the reasons for venue and feeling like an area has been compromised, where are you going to sequester a jury that has not, in some form or fashion, especially given how we know how the length of time it takes for things to get to trial, right? And all the motions that come with it. So please weigh in, both of you. But I think that's what makes this a little different, Ann Rose, is that Attorney Johnson Lewis, I don't know where you're going to go necessarily where there has not been someone who has heard about this case.
What do you think, Robin? We got one more question before we move on to implicit.
Yeah, I think I sort of like looked at it maybe a different way, even like dealing with Mr. Floyd and Mr. Arbery's cases. One, and to the point of, you're not going to go anywhere of where people aren't aware of the case. But I see their cases as a little different in that if I'm the defense, what do I gain in terms of if I want to go to another county versus I stay in this county of where, and I don't know like the demographics. I know in terms of for Georgia or like if it's Brunswick, I think I'm more familiar with the demographics there. But if you stay in that county and you're the defense, then your jurors know that your elected district attorney, the ones that you put in office, in Mr. Arbery's case, thought that this should not go forward. In Mr. Floyd's case, your elected district attorney thought that this was the appropriate charge. And in both cases, you have outside entities coming into your community saying, no, the people you put here to do the job did it wrong, and we're going to do it better. I think that's something that they'd have to consider. So
Roderick says that he saw, I'm going to just read this verbatim. I saw the craziest thing from the lawyer for one of the officers. He said that the public should have intervened, and that the body cam shows his client asking the murderer to roll him over, and he was a 4-day cop listening to a 20-year veteran. So obviously this particular attorney's trying to try this in the media, saying, gee, he was just there. He just came on board listening to a 20-year veteran. But what say you to an attorney making the argument that the public should have intervened.
Yeah,
So
I don't even know what to say about that. I just
yeah, he was on. I saw
what?
it on Cuomo's show on CNN, and he said
Ain't no
that, and
liquor in here.
Cuomo
Go ahead.
and Cuomo like checked him on it in terms of saying like, hey, how can you say that the public should have intervened and not the police officer? And then he, tried to backtrack it. Yeah, so that's not an argument that's going to help him if this case ends up going to trial. But I guess he felt that that's something he had to try to do to try to like get that out there. I think the other point though is because I had read or heard like two of them were, I guess like relatively new. Like one had just been on, like I think he said, for Roger said for 4 days, and I think another one was like new as well. So he has that issue in terms of, do I go against a supervising officer? But common decency, you see a man dying, you have to do something. Whether you're police and you hold an officer probably in higher regard and would expect them to intervene, and hence that's why he's charged with what's it, aiding and abetting.
Let me ask you this, Renee. Because one of the things that I found pretty compelling was that, of course, when it came out with Chauvin's, however you say his name, with his history of complaints, his former potential charge where he could have been removed from or could have been prosecuted, and Senator Klobuchar, who was the DA at the time, declined to do it. And so the outcry, of course, has been all of this could have been avoided in theory. Like if you had the courage as a prosecutor to prosecute him then, I don't even care if the facts are weak. I mean, come on now, felony assault's not hard to prove. Like it doesn't have to be murder. It could be felonious assault. Like we don't have to necessarily go there, but she made the choice not to prosecute. Is that political suicide for her? Who knows? Really don't care one way or the other about that as far as the politics side of it. But what does that mean? And what does that say to the fact that, is it possible, of course, it's speculation, that all of this could have been avoided if that discretion would have been used? And do you think that some sort of bias had anything to do with it? And how she viewed him, how she viewed the victim, if I remember correctly, because I don't want to misspeak. I think the victim was Native American. I don't want to misspeak, but wasn't a white victim. I'll say that. But do you think that had anything to do with it?
I don't know her personally, but I will say this: we all have it, and And the fact that people aren't actively working to recognize it or check it means there's harm that's being done every day. So not only a harm of the fact that he wasn't prosecuted or corrected or sanctioned, because even without prosecution, I mean, if you're hearing allegations about an officer, someone who is taking an oath to uphold the law, doing things, even within his system, you would hope there's accountability before you break the law. If you've done something that's even slightly off, but I know that we have implicit bias. I know that it's so much easier to have excuses for people who are not of color when it comes to why they did things. And going back to my earlier point, it's not just the prosecutor, it's our jurors. Do we have to say George Zimmerman's name? I mean, do we have to talk about Trayvon? It's jurors. It's the fact, and I polled some jurors afterwards, and you'd be surprised. I know the two of you have as well. People don't want to see some things about certain people, right? Unfortunately, when it comes to some of our systems, I say this often, racism hurts everybody, not just people of color. In the same way, in that similar circumstance, somebody would have been charged off the police force more than likely, or in jail. We overcharge and look for things when it comes to people of color, when it comes to anything in our systems, right? When it comes to arrests, when it comes to child welfare, we remove children of color from their homes. But we're often leaving white children in homes, right? Because we think that people who are white don't do certain things. So this white officer surely couldn't have, done anything wrong. He didn't know better, or it was a mistake, or it was the victim's fault. So racism hurts not only people of color because we're overcharged and we end up being harmed, but it also hurts white people in that there are white people who are being harmed by white people, and people don't want to see it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I once again, I don't know her personally, but you can't tell me that she doesn't have it, that we don't have it, that you don't have it. And anyone who isn't really working to help the problem or to create the solution for it, I would say you're still a part of the problem.
So two more. Well, thought we were done with the questions, but this is a good one. So I want to make sure, and I'm gonna pose this one for you, Rob. And so Roderick asked.
I'm sorry, Yolanda. I think I lost you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You were cutting out a little bit. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
It
Did you
might
hear
be
the
just a
last part
little
what I
bit.
said about
I
I don't know
did.
if she's I don't know if she intentionally did anything, but everyone has bias. So you can't tell me that she didn't.
Right. Okay. So Roderick asked, but this would be more relevant to George Floyd. Are there any records from Chauvin's previous disciplinary proceedings? I don't know if we necessarily know the answer to that, but the bigger question is, can they be entered into evidence as, oh, now he wants to be fancy, as modus operandi in that case? And for you personally, have you, well, no, we hadn't really had that issue in North Carolina so much, but, or do they have to have proceedings before some sort of a review board before any of his prior disciplinary actions could be used against him in trial? Because I think the question is probably not, because I don't know if it's a 608 issue, or I can't really get under 404, maybe 609. I don't know, but I'm not sure if any of that would be admissible. But I'm thinking off the top of my head. What do you think?
Yeah. If there are records, disciplinary records, of Chauvin using excessive force, I think that the prosecution would seek to, introduce those. If they're like, I don't know the procedure of how they would have to get them in Minnesota, or if they have to make a special request, and it just becomes part of discovery, which is all the evidence. Discovery is all the evidence in a case that's gathered and is turned over to the defense and the prosecution has. If they do have those records, though, then I say they would definitely try to get those in, and it would be probably like a hearing before the trial, or some type of hearing that the jury doesn't hear it, and then the judge makes the determination whether or not it's proper for the jury to hear this evidence as well.
Mm-hmm. So, okay. So for those of you
and can I go?
Sure.
Just about the for Klobuchar in terms of Chauvin. So there were two shootings. One happened in 2008, the other in 2006, him and some other officers. Klobuchar was already in Congress when that case went to the grand jury. But I think what you do have is what type of, I think you can, talk about what type of office or culture she had in that office in terms of how they viewed those particular cases. Because I was talking to someone and I was saying, well, Klobuchar was already gone, right? And they're saying, yeah, but she has this type of culture that allowed those cases to not get the proper attention that they deserve when you're dealing with misconduct by police.
And so I think that's definitely important to note. So, okay, so the last thing I want to spend some time with, and y'all, we're going to have to come back and dig deeper, because there's some other questions I don't think I'm gonna be able to get to just in the interest of time, but I really want to have time to talk about implicit bias. So I would absolutely say this to everyone watching, whether it's now or the replay, and Renee is going to take the lead on this, on what implicit bias is. But listen, if you or anyone loves to say, I don't see color, then yes, that's not true. That is not true. It is not true. It is not true. And the reality is that we all have biases, whether you're Black, white, Latino, whatever it is, we all have biases. What has been, and I don't know if this is still the case if this was still happening before COVID, but one thing that Charlotte had, which is incredibly powerful with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, is a 2-day program where we would go through this entire process of learning about race, racism, implicit bias, all of that. It is incredibly powerful. I will be completely honest, when I went through it as a judge, I didn't go back to the second day. Nobody knew that. And but I could not I could not go back the second day. Like the first day, I remember one, just as a history major and as a history teacher, it was like information overload. Like some of the things I already knew, but I think the thing that really bothered me were the other people in the room, and so many other people in the room who just didn't seem to care. And the more I saw people who didn't seem to care, the more pissed off it made me, because I'm like, this is so incredibly important. And I think at the time, I think all the DAs were required to do it, public defenders. I think the majority of police officers, this is a long time ago. I don't know if that's still the case, but I had nightmares that night. I legit had nightmares that night. Lots of running, lots of fighting, like just things just coming at me constantly through the night, and just like images of things that I had seen, of Black people getting brutalized. I mean, none of this was even in the seminar, but it just stuck on my spirit in such a way. I just was like, I can't go back now. And I kept saying, I'm gonna go back, I'm gonna go take it again. But I couldn't go back the next day. And I understand the second day is even more powerful, but I just personally, I couldn't go back the next day. So Renee, first of all, tell us what implicit bias is, and then tell us about what race matters for juvenile justice is and how you got involved.
Sure. Race, implicit bias, first of all, is attitudes, stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, all our decisions unconsciously. So when you think of explicit bias, you think of preferences. Like, I want a man who's 6'2". Implicit bias is often not realizing that I look at people who have scuffy shoes a certain way. That I see scuffy shoes and I immediately start to think. So it's those unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that we have, and we develop them early. When you think of them, sometimes that's not a bad thing when you think of your implicit bias, and that our brains are wired to quickly do a SWOT analysis and to make sure we're safe. So, if you touch a stove or you see something's hot or red, you know it's hot, and you're trained to stop. When we drive our cars, I know this happens with most of us. Most of us, we get in our cars by God's grace, we get where we go. We don't even think about, did I turn the key or push the button? How many red lights did I go through? Especially when it comes to going to work, there's some things we do automatically. So our brains really do process automatically. And that's not a bad thing, because it takes a whole lot of energy, if you know brain science, to really stop and think. That being said, when it comes to certain things in life, like making decisions, having input in someone's life, no matter what the kind of case is, whether it's criminal, whether it's custody, whether it's something as simple as a name change, you need to really slow down and to check your biases. Make sure that you are not acting upon what you think and not what the facts are. The amazing Elisa Chingari, who is the elected clerk of court for Mecklenburg County, our first African-American elected clerk who I serve under, she says something that's incredibly important that I think ties into bias. How we see people is how we serve them.
Say that again. How we see people is how we serve them.
And when we have all these biases that we all have, even people of color, about people along the lines of race, we often will serve people based on what we think about them and what they deserve, as opposed to serving them in a way that affirms their dignity or really honors the circumstances or the facts before us. And so Race Matters for Juvenile Justice is a court-led initiative whereby we are really envisioning a Charlotte where people are served, where people are consequenced based on what they do and not who they are, because destiny and demography should not always be tied. And so what we do is we bring together system leaders. So we are institutional organizers. You hear a lot about grassroots organizations, and they're so necessary. But what Race Matters for Juvenile Justice does, it convenes leaders from the systems, because systems are the things that's affecting harm on people, right? And so we have, I'm proud to say that around the table, we have the juvenile court judges, and we also have a Superior Court judge and Judge Lou Trosh, who has helped to really shape Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, along with Elisa Chingari and other leaders. We have the Guardian Ad Litem's office. We do have CMPD. We do have the county. We do have the city. We have these amazing leaders that do things every day to impact families. and children in the juvenile justice system. And so one of the things that we want to do around Race Matters, we look at the data, and the data shows the disparity. It tells the story. Doesn't matter what the system is, whether it's healthcare, whether it's the justice system, juvenile justice system, financial system. African American people are harmed disproportionate to our percentage in this country, our percentage in this community. And so we convene and we really talk about things. We don't call each other out. We really seek to call each other in, to really look at the numbers and to make sure that there are things in place to really affect change in the system. So we look at practice change. One of the things that we're doing at the clerk's office, she has the diversity initiative, equity initiative, is we're looking at, even when it comes to people getting their rights restored, how many people of color even know that they have the right to have their rights restored after they've served time? Because that directly impacts voting. And so there's so many things we don't think about when it comes to systems and implicit bias, but it's real. And the thing that I want to say, I am proud that the conversation is happening. Thank you for advancing it, Yolanda. We do have people in our community here in Charlotte that care about it, that are being mindful of it. Judges have bench cards in juvenile court. We have leaders who have accountability partners that can kind of talk to them and say, why did you make that decision? Why did you do what you need to do? Where this really needs to go further when we talk about systems changes, are we going to one day put something in place where our lay citizens, who are the most important part of this process, jurors who sit and they judge people, are we going to possibly one day have something in place where they can take the implicit bias, the implicit association test that you've seen Judge Trott put up, so that they come in knowing what's in their ground? How do you feel about Black folk? How do you feel about people who are poor? How do you feel about single moms? How do you feel about white folk? How do you feel about older people? How do you feel about people based on their gender or how they gender identify? How do you feel about people based on their orientation? If you don't know what's in your ground, I don't know if it's always fair to judge people and not be mindful that you bring things to your judgment. And so that's what implicit bias is in a nutshell. And what RMJJ is seeking to do is really challenge our systems to look at their bias and to do things to change the practice of the system.
Do you know if CMPD and the DA's office, are they still required to go through the seminar?
The requirement, I'm not sure right now under the new leadership what's going to happen as far as CMPD. CMPD has been a great partner, and their officers have been going for years. The DA's office under Mr. Merriweather, Spencer Merriweather, their teams, they're going as well. I don't know if the word is requirement, because I can't speak for Mr. Merriweather or for the current chief or the incoming, but I will say that they have been incredibly strong partners and they have sent their people. You also see that with Department of Social Services, their workforce is there, the Guardian ad litem's office, public defenders are now around the table as well. So Mr. Tully, he has people there. And so, and of course, CMS, my apologies for not saying that earlier, but they're sending their people there. And when it comes to these stakeholders, they're able to go without the sometimes the cost associated with private citizens going. So there's a commitment to really support the systems represented by our partners at the table.
And so all that's fine, well and good. We all know that biases exist.
Yes.
We all have them. But let's just get to the real. What good does it make for us to know? Well, first of all, if you don't understand it or if you're not willing to take the test or any of that, we just never get anywhere as far as that's concerned. But when you see officers, even in Charlotte, when we had the issues that we've seen crop up in terms of how police actions have negatively impacted the community, negatively impacted peaceful protests and all that, that's a whole nother show. But all that being said, we know what it is. Well, so what? So what do we do with it once we know?
I think the thing that's so important when it comes at least to systems change is you start with your own system first. So I start with my ground. Our ground is the clerk's office, and being and holding each other accountable, making sure that you're having touch points where it's not just going to a 2-day class and that's it. The way RMJJ is set up is that 2-day class is only the entry. We also have catalyzing change where people come together and that they share their stuff. They talk about what's heavy. They talk about what's real. And more importantly, they talk about what are you doing? How are you processing things? And what actions are you taking now that you processed it? We break out into people of color. We break out into our white allies. And so one of the things that RMJJ affords our system partners to do is to even ask what you're saying, Yolanda, so what? Okay, so how is this really impacting you? How are you rolling out this change in your organization? Now, the thing that I think is so important is when you get the heart and the head of those in leadership, those who are systems leaders, and they buy into it, that can become a part of performance evaluation when it comes to your staff.
Mm-hmm.
If you really believe that implicit bias is something that we all have, and that it's not just important to take this 2-day class, but to make sure my workforce that they're doing their own individual homework, they're reading about the history of this country and what has happened to people of color. They are taking the implicit bias test. They have accountability partners, and that you have someone in your life professionally who can say, you did something that looked a little weird. Tell me why. Did you notice that you talked to someone a certain way? If people are brave and bold enough to be willing to take that journey, I do think you'll see transformative change. And so you can't legislate morality. That's something we're seeing consistently with the cases that you talked about tonight. You can't, no matter what class you put people in, if people's hearts don't want to change, that's going to be hard. But when people in leadership commit to this and say that I am going to set the standard, and the people I hire, this is the standard you have to keep, that you are committed to doing some heart checks and some head checks and looking at data and asking the tough questions, calling folk in and not just out, I think you'll see the change. Keep in mind, this is not something that will happen overnight. This is not just a moment, it is a movement. And so anyway, so I think, I hope that answers your question, that when you say, so what, we may not see it in the moment, but as leaders commit to this, I do think you will start to see more of those changes, at least in our community.
I have a couple comments. They want to know what the website is for Race Matters and to get information for the next classes. Are they still offered monthly? Well, I know they're not right now, but.
Not now, but so the website is www.rmjj.org.
Okay.
You can also email me, renee.little@nccourts.org, if you have specific questions or want to find out more about our classes. We are on a pause because of COVID. Those who have already taken the 2-day class, we're still meeting. So we're having our catalyzing change meetings. Those cohorts are still meeting the process. We're having another meeting Tuesday. So we've still been meeting virtually, of course, for safety, to process, to cry, to shout, to scream, to strategize.
Mm-hmm. And so that's what's up on your screen for RMJJ. Very simple, rmjj.org, to learn more about the organization and to take one of the 2-day courses. I know I got to go back. I just got to get my mind right. I'm going back, Renee. I just got to get my mind right.
You're coming back.
I'm coming back. It was just a bad idea for me to do that while I was on the bench. Like, real talk. That was just a bad idea. Like, I already know how I'm my father's child, and I just get so right. Yeah, I was like, let me just not. No, not right now.
We want judges to come. I mean, the judges are going to, and I spoke about bench cards earlier. That is something that's come out of the National Family Courts that that juvenile judges are using, and I think it's an amazing tool. I mean, anything you can do to slow yourself down and to ask yourself questions. What role did race play in this? What role did gender play in this? I mean, you've done family law. Rob, you've done criminal. You know that biases creep up even when we don't want them to. And so I think the thing that we're really trying to commit to, especially with the practice change of systems, is what can we do to slow ourselves down and to have the conversation and to know that it's there? Because knowing, as they said, G.I. Joe is half the battle. Knowing that you have it is half the battle. And what I'm seeing, allies and even people who are white but not allies, there's a conversation now in this country about implicit bias. George Floyd and others did not die in vain. If we can at least be at the point where people besides Black people are saying, you know what, there's stuff in the water. It's not the individual fish, it's the lake. So if race is a systems issue, you've got to have a systems approach to really trying to combat it.
And so for those of you tuning in, here's the website for you to be able to take the implicit bias or test is at implicit.harvard.edu. implicit.harvard.edu. I suggest that you start with the race one. Don't, like I said earlier in the show, don't be trying to cheat the test like I did. I tried it, didn't go well. And I'll say cheat, like I just thought, boom, boom, boom. I'm gonna just, because this is what I think they trying to go. You know how you try to take a test, you try to figure, oh, okay, they trying to see, yeah, and I'm not going for that. Yeah. Anyway, you can't do it that way. But I
And
do.
Yolanda,
But
we do also have community presentations. I'm the coordinator of the Speakers Bureau. And so we do have community presentations via Zoom every other month. We'll be doing one in July about racial inequities in the juvenile justice system in light of Raise the Age. I'm super excited about that.
Okay, and I will put that in the comments as well. So definitely make sure that you take the implicit bias test. And of course, at the and can you repeat your email again? Somebody's asking for your email again.
Yes, Renee, Renee .little, Little, at NC Courts with an S on the end of it, COURTS.org.
Okay, very good. All right, and so I want to wrap up with a couple things, and this might be deeply personal for both of you, but I think it's important so that people understand what we have to deal with even as attorneys on a day-to-day basis in this fight for justice. That's why I kind of started with the question, like, what is the system? But to your point, and I just want to say this, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it is so important for anyone watching or anyone that watches the replay. Please don't try to get out of jury service. Don't try to get out of jury service. All of us are trial attorneys. Rob and I have been trying cases for years, and a lot of what we say is not what we know is what can be proven. And those 12 or 14 jurors in the box are the ones that are making a decision. Mm-hmm. And it is so incredibly important that we have jurors who are willing to serve. And I know Rob can speak to plenty of cases, and I can too, where the facts appear to be one way on paper, and you get in trial and officer blurts out something that was like, wait a minute, this wasn't on the statement. Or, you get pretrial motions denied and it looks like it's all going downhill from there because evidence didn't get suppressed. But I say this very specifically. I didn't understand how important jury selection was until I was probably 5 years into my practice. And I stopped getting worked up about pretrial motions. Oh my God, this judge is probably going to deny my motion to suppress. Oh my goodness gracious. Because the reality is you really only need one person. That is literally true. And the point is that you never know who's in your box. You have to know how to, obviously, as an attorney, pick a jury because that's critical. But I used to always say there's always a golden hippie in the jury pool. That's a secret because there's always, and that golden hippie is probably going to end up being my foreperson, and that person's going to lead the charge. And that advocacy that goes on behind closed doors, you'd be surprised what jurors pay attention to. Your voice, your inflection, what you wear, how you interact with your client. Do you appear to be afraid of them? Do you sit too far away, or do you actually have conversations? All of these are things that we see all the time. And this goes to your point, Renee, that from the time that a jury walks into a courtroom, they're going to make snap judgment about your client just by how you're sitting, just how you're interacting with that person, how that person's dressed. Like all of that is going to be something that people are going to make decisions on because we are human. But we also have to be aware that we've got jurors that we don't know where their biases are. We try to flesh that out in voir dire and questions, but we don't know that. And so that's why the system is so important, and it's so important to understand implicit bias because it does make a difference. And so I don't say that lightly. Please don't try to get out of jury selection. Stay there. Allow yourself to be picked if you get picked, but because it's so incredibly important. Judges are important as far as calling balls and strikes, but jury service is critical. I mean, how you said it earlier, Renee. George Zimmerman's case was decided by jurors who didn't quite get it. Like even after the verdict, they were like, "Oh, if." Whole nother story. But please, 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 I can't stress that enough as far as the system is concerned. 2 personal questions for you, and we're going to wrap it up. So tell us about a case that either made you question the system in its entirety in terms of, do you even want to stay and do this work? And no, that is the question. Tell us about a case that dealt with all of these issues, so much so that you almost question whether or not you still wanted to go in and fight another day?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. I'm thinking. Yeah, let me defer to Renee first. Let me give me like another 30 seconds.
Of course, I did juvenile work, so I won't say the name, but for those who don't know, for young people that get in trouble and some teenagers, there's the electronic monitoring program where you can put an ankle bracelet on that person as an alternative to being in detention or incarcerated. I had a young man who had done a lot of stuff, had a nice little resume, but got in trouble, was facing what we call training school. That's the highest level of punishment in the juvenile system. It is juvenile prison. You get sent away possibly until you're 21, depending on the charges. This young man was facing that highest disposition. Parents were indigent, and when I say indigent, didn't have money. They were also transient. So he gets put on an ankle bracelet and was told, you have to be with your parents. You do one thing, you're coming back to detention and we're not letting you out. I get a call like at 7:00 in the morning, maybe 3 days later, that they wanted to put him back in detention. I was like, for what? I've been checking on him. Miss Renee was calling him. His mom and dad knew how serious it was that he not get in trouble. And the Department of Public Safety that was monitoring him said, well, we see where his ping shows that he was not in the house. He was not in his home. He went this and where. So they went ahead and put him in detention. And I want to shout out Judge Curitin, who had the case, who was incredibly thoughtful when I brought in the implicit bias analysis. And this is what happened. My client's parents were getting kicked out of the hotel that they were in. It was showing the pings because they had to go get a U-Haul, try to find people to help them get out the hotel and find a place to stay. He was with his parents the entire time, but because it wasn't in the house, he got picked up. I think his mom told them, we got kicked. He's been with us the whole time, but it was, I don't have to tell you his race. He had bad charges. They locked him up. I called a chamber conference in front of Judge Curitin. The DA was there, the Department of Public Safety. And I advocated, but I brought up the racial analysis. I said, how is it that this young man, yes, he's in trouble. He's got this ankle monitor. He was told to stay in the house, but they were getting kicked out of a hotel. He has been with his parents the whole time. No one cared about that. And I brought it up. I said, if this was a young white girl who had an ankle monitor and she was getting kicked out of her home, but she's with her parents, would it have been as easy to lock her up and then ask the question? My colleague on the other side, the DA, initially was really offended. Like, what are you talking about? This isn't about race. I said, I'm not calling you a racist. I'm just saying, why is it so easy to see Black boys, even the ones who get in trouble, as grown men and stop, not children? He's with his parents. Judge Curitin let him out. And Judge Curitin said in chambers, and I remember it gave me hope. He said, Miss Little, I was Jared at the time. I wasn't married, but he said, I received your argument. He said, I am concerned. He said, yes, this young man has horrible charges, but I don't understand how we could feel comfortable locking him up when his parents are getting kicked out. No, he's not in his home, but he's with them, and he let him out. But he said, you know what? It's no point in being involved in these conversations about implicit bias if we're not willing to bring this up in the hardest moments. And he applauded me for doing so. I applauded him for being a judge who understood the analysis and understood my heart and said, I'm not going to punish this boy for poverty. That made a difference in that young man's life. And there are other great judges besides Judge Curitin, so many in juvenile court that I could name. But that case stayed with me and it made a difference. And I'll be frank, once my kid got out of that trouble and he served for probation, you didn't see a lot after that because someone believed in him. But more importantly, I wasn't afraid to make that argument. It's okay to bring up race sometimes. We're so careful to not bring it up, but we have to, because if we aren't willing to say their name and to call it out and sometimes call people in, people will suffer. I wasn't willing to let this young man suffer because I was afraid to put race in the space. I put it in the space. And my client, who already suffered by even being put in jail, at least got a better result.
There it is. Rob, you ready?
Yeah, I was trying to, give it some thought. I tend to represent or individuals who have been accused of committing serious, violent, or heinous offenses, and because of that, I tend to be in trial on a regular basis. And when you go to trial on a regular basis, you're not going to win every case. So there's some cases you win, some cases you lose, and you have to be able to, I think, compartmentalize at least on some level. But even though in terms of any case that you lose hurts, stays with you because you feel in terms of, you have to have such tunnel vision and put so much into it. So I can think of in terms of, I've had one case, I'll talk in generalities, charged with a serious offense. Based on the letter of the law, if you say technicality, not factor in all the things that occurred based on the letter of law, he would be, told him he would be found guilty. The only client of where I may have said that you need to take this offer. But based on in terms of the type of case it is and his defense, it was one that we are not precluded to argue by law. In this particular case, the DA filed motions to make sure the judge instructed me that I could not argue this particular defense. And then the DA also did some things of where, although are legal, anybody would say, hey, that's sort of underhanded that they were allowed to do that. And I haven't seen that done before, and I haven't seen that DA do that since. But that's the case in terms of, that stays with me. And then if I could kind of discuss when you talk about the importance of jury selection, and then when you talk about implicit bias, that you see things, I go to other counties, and you can see how I've seen prosecutors do everything they could to ensure Black and brown people did not end up on their jury. And as long as they can come up with some half-baked reason, then the judge allows it. It's very rare to succeed on an argument that someone is being kept off the jury because of their race. But it goes into, like I said, implicit bias in terms of that prosecutor not thinking, or even, not even implicit, prosecutor stated explicitly, this Black woman isn't smart enough to be on this jury, even though college educated, worked at a bank. But based on the issues, she stated, I don't think she's smart enough to be here. And the judge says, okay.
Wow.
And that's our favorite county.
Wow.
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 There we go. This is why judges are so important. So important. And it's not enough to know, but to know who they are and to be able to advocate to get judges who have no business being on that bench off, because that's a testament to a system that has been broken for a long time. So when you heard that, Rob, how do you grit your teeth and take that?
Yeah, well, in terms of, it's one of those things of where the only people in the courtroom, well, the only person in the courtroom who looks like me is my client. So you say that's including prosecutors, jury, court staff, court personnel, judge, and we have to, you make the objection to put it on the record, but that falls under that particular judge's discretion, and you have no recourse beyond that.
Yeah, which is very true. I think I know for me, I even hate to talk about it but anyway, I had a client charged with trafficking heroin, clearly a user, not a drug dealer, was just in the vehicle, nothing found on this person, just not even close to drug trafficking. But this what we get to in terms of always charging the top count, let the chips fall where they may. And he was a white male and clearly had some major drug issue problems. Had to fight tooth and nail and was able to get him out on bond, pre-trial actually. And it's funny because he got out, but I was trying to see him before he physically got released, and I couldn't get over there in time. But he called, and we talked, and he was going to, he said he was ready to go to seminary, and he just really, had to get he was just so grateful because he's like nobody had ever really fought for him before, and he was going to get some help this time. And he's just being in the house, not being around the same people, and just really grateful for the opportunity. But, you're still facing trafficking charges. Let's just be realistic. Whew. 3 days later, I get a call from his mom, and he died of an overdose. And she had no idea she said he hadn't left the house, hadn't been anywhere. And she thinks what happened was that he may have had something stashed somewhere in his room, and he saw it. And the thing that was so emotionally, it was explosive, is that when she went up to his room and she knocked on the door, she walked in and she thought he was praying because he always prays on his knees. Oh. And she thought that he was praying, but he had passed in the prayer position. And she said that she felt like he was praying for strength in that moment, and he passed away. Because she found what looked like something was a stash, because she said he couldn't have gotten it from anyone or anywhere because he hadn't left the house. And I just busted out in tears because in that moment I felt so guilty, like, oh my God, should he have gotten out? Should he have stayed in and get treatment? Like, oh my gosh, like I'm questioning the fact, did I make a mistake? Was this advocacy a mistake? But she said, I need you to stop crying because for me, the way I see it is like you gave me my son back. Like my son, I hadn't had my son in 15 years, like my son. And she said, he finally came back to me. Like he was smiling, he was laughing. I saw joy in his face that I had never seen before. And she's like, and I'm sad he's gone, but I'm glad I had that time with him. And she's like, I don't know if you are okay with coming to the funeral, would love to have you there. But that in that moment, like I almost said, what do I do? Like, is this something that I should be doing now? Because I questioned, is the advocacy too much? Even though she said that, and even though that was comforting in that moment, I could not get the image of this man on his knees praying to God apparently for strength and it's just deep. And so, I say that, and that's why I asked you that, both of you, that in terms of the personal things that you've dealt with, because the whole process of this whole system, and I say that loosely because it's a combination of systems that make up our criminal justice system. Like we have to do things to reform it. We have to address mental health. We have to address drug use. We have to stop criminalizing addiction. Like we criminalize addiction all the time. And especially where, crack is treated one way, heroin's treated another way, just depending on the narrative. And it just highlights the implicit bias. Rob, to your point, it highlights the importance of having not just good jurors, but good judges who don't make decisions like that, just blatantly right. And I know what county I ain't gonna say it, but we know which county that came from. But you know what? That's not unusual. It's not unusual. And I'm sure that could have happened in countless other counties in North Carolina and other states. And Renee, to your point, I think it's important because understand that having the courage to speak on race when people get upset because they are being defined as race baiting or playing the race card, it matters. It matters. So I salute both of you for your advocacy. And Renee, I can't wait to see you on the bench. I just cannot wait to see you on the bench because I know you will, you're humble. You understand the idea of mercy. when it's needed, and you also will be just in your decisions. And Rob, why I specifically reached out to you is because, I mean, you're a warrior. I laughed. I was like, shoot, when I come back, I'm good for a while because they on Rob's butt like they used to be on mine before I went on the bench. Because like Rob's life is what my life was in 2013 to 14. I was in court. I was in trial every month. They were trying to wear me down. No, I ain't. And say, if y'all get this guilty, that means everybody gonna be tired by the end of the week, because it might be a 2-day trial, but I promise you that jury selection gonna take 3 days. And if you get a guilty, oh, you're going to be tired. You're going to think twice about when it's time to come back. And Rob, haven't just seen you in court recently. Like I joke, I had to say this to y'all publicly. Like I literally was in the back of the courtroom and I saw Josh do his opening. I almost wanted to stand up and cheer, like for real. And then I caught part of Rob's cross, and I was just like, I want to try a case so bad. Like, let me in. And it's just so amazing when I see attorneys that look like us, and there's countless attorneys out here who fight the good fight all the time, black or white or whatever the race is. But we can't ignore the fact that our system is broken. And I think the two stories that you shared with us tonight show us that the system is indeed broken. But when there's people who care and there's advocates that are there, there's some solace in that. Like I still think about him, but I also know, and I have to remember what his mom said, that she had her son back for the first time in so many years. And that's the memories that she holds on to. And then, of course, in all situations, like we have a responsibility not only to be educated about what these systems are, but obviously educated about our biases. Okay, I thought so. I thought it didn't sound right coming out of my mouth.
2 biases.
Biases. Biases as well. So with that being said, thank you both.
Thank you
so much. Now listen, the podcast studio is back open, so I need to do a full on show with both of you where we go digging all back into who you are and all that good stuff, and then we're going to tackle a topic in more detail. So I'm excited. I'll shoot you guys some dates. For those of you who are tuning in or who have tuned in with us, thank you for joining us. If you're catching the replay, make sure that you feel free to share it, set up a watch party, because I know we covered a lot. This is the first of the 5-part series. Next week, we're going to be talking about police reform. Our guests will be retired Assistant Chief Vicki Foster and retired CMPD Officer Keith Way. We're going to have a real talk conversation about the state of what Charlotte looks like as far as CMPD, but we're also going to be talking about reform in a major way because they both have some great ideas in terms of what we can do. Our guest after that will be Sheriff Gary McFadden, who has a very interesting history, being both a CMPD homicide detective for years, to obviously stepping into the role of public service as our elected sheriff. Our next guest after that will be Annalee Harden and Arcavius Armstrong, who both have very different stories as far as their experiences actually within the system. I can't announce our last guest just yet. I'm confirming with her, but I just need to say the name. Y'all gonna be like, what? And I'm like, yes. So we're gonna be talking about all of it. So, and we may add another show because but all jokes aside, guys, like I definitely want to have the two of you specifically back because I kind of want to see where we are in about another month or so to kind of tackle these issues as we see how they evolve over time. So thank you both so much for your time. Thank you guys for those of you who have tuned in. And of course, as always, make sure that you like, follow, and subscribe at all things The Convo Pod Show. We will see you next Wednesday live right here. Well, not right here, you know what I mean. But we'll see you next Wednesday live here on The Conversation. And we will be talking about police reform. So definitely tune in and chime in. Make sure you do your test. Make sure you go and check out and see what your own implicit biases are, and make sure that you have the courage to check yourself, because we all have them. So have a good night, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. Bye, y'all. Good night.